mid-14th century, peasants were the backbone of medieval society, yet their existence was harsh and precarious. The vast majority of people in Europe were peasants, living in small rural villages or on manors controlled by nobles and lords. The feudal system bound peasants to the land. Many were serfs, legally tied to their lord's estate, obligated to provide labor, produce, and taxes. Freedom was rare and the social hierarchy rigid. Daily life revolved around endless toil. From sunrise to sunset, peasants labored in the fields, growing staple crops like wheat, rye, barley, and oats, as well as vegetables and occasionally livestock. The tools were primitive: wooden plows, sickles, and hand hoes, and the methods inefficient. Crop failures due to poor weather, pests, or disease were common, and food shortages frequent. Housing was basic and often squalid. Peasant cottages were small, one-room structures made of wattle and daub or timber, with thatched roofs. Floors were dirt, and heating was provided by a single hearth. Sanitation was non-existent. Human waste was disposed of nearby or in open pits. Such conditions bred disease and misery. Nutrition was minimal and monotonous. Bread made from coarse rye or barley was a staple, supplemented by beans, cabbage, onions, and the occasional bit of cheese or salted meat. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening immune systems. Clean water was scarce, and contaminated wells often caused outbreaks of dysentery and other intestinal diseases. Healthcare was primitive and based largely on superstition and herbal remedies. No formal medical knowledge or infrastructure existed for the common folk. Illnesses and injuries frequently became fatal due to lack of treatment. Life expectancy was low, infant mortality high, and the constant threat of famine, war, and disease hung over peasants like a shadow. The arrival of the Black Death. In 1347, the Black Death first arrived in Europe through the Mediterranean ports, spreading rapidly along trade routes. It was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas carried on black rats, but also spread through respiratory droplets in pneumonic form. The plague arrived suddenly and mercilessly. Peasant villages connected by roads and markets were vulnerable. Once the disease reached a village, the spread was swift and devastating. The symptoms began with fever, chills, headaches, fatigue, and muscle aches, symptoms that might have seemed like any common illness at first. However, rapidly, buboes, painful, swollen lymph nodes appearing in the groin, armpits, or neck, developed. These blackish swellings gave the disease its name, the Black Death. Victims also suffered bleeding from orifices, vomiting blood, and delirium. Death often followed within days, sometimes hours. No treatment existed. Quarantine was unheard of or ineffective. Medical knowledge was inadequate, and many doctors fled infected areas or perished themselves. Peasants, isolated and lacking resources, were particularly defenseless. Daily life shattered. As the plague took hold, peasants' daily lives collapsed. Whole families and entire villages were wiped out. Those who were not yet sick lived in constant terror. The loss of workers meant fields went untilled. Food supplies dwindled, and starvation loomed. Labor shortages disrupted the agricultural cycle and local economies. Peasants still owed rents, labor duties, and taxes to their lords. However, with so many dead, it became nearly impossible to meet these demands. Lords attempted to enforce their rights through harsh means, raising tensions. Some peasants resisted, leading to unrest and rebellion. Social order unraveled. Mass graves replaced proper burials. Priests and clergy were overwhelmed or died themselves, leaving spiritual needs unmet. Fear bred superstition. Some peasants blamed minority groups, accused neighbors of witchcraft, or believed the plague was divine punishment. Hunger, cold, and exhaustion compounded suffering. The peasants' already meager diets became even more meager as food became scarce. Many faced starvation alongside the plague. The Black Death's grip tightens. As the plague ravaged Europe, peasants faced not only physical suffering but the collapse of their social and economic world. The sheer scale of death was staggering. In some regions, as much as half or more of the population perished within just a few years. Entire villages disappeared, their fields lying fallow and overgrown. Because peasants were the primary agricultural laborers, the shortage of workers threatened food production and survival. Fields went unplowed, crops unharvested. Starvation and malnutrition became common companions to the disease. Food scarcity also led to rising prices, which peasants could not afford. At the same time, feudal obligations did not pause for the plague. Lords demanded their rents and labor services even as peasants struggled to stay alive. Those who survived were often forced into harder labor for less compensation, fueling resentment and desperation. Brutality and exploitation. Some landowners saw the labor shortage as an opportunity to exploit peasants further. Instead of lowering rents or easing demands, many increased them or forced peasants to work longer hours. This economic pressure pushed peasants to the brink of starvation. Attempts to escape these harsh conditions were dangerous. Serfs who fled their lord's land risked being hunted down, imprisoned, or worse. Laws were enacted to prevent peasants from moving freely, cementing their status despite the demographic catastrophe. Peasants who did not die of plague often died from exhaustion, hunger, or violence. The breakdown of social order led to increased banditry, lawlessness, and localized conflicts. The once familiar rhythms of village life were replaced by chaos. Psychological terror and social breakdown. The plague instilled an omnipresent fear. Death was random, swift, and merciless. Peasants watched family members, neighbors, and friends waste away and die. The sound of coughing, groaning, and weeping filled the air. Mass graves replaced proper funerals. The dead were often buried without clergy or ceremony, deepening the spiritual anguish. Religious faith, a pillar of medieval life, was shaken. Priests and monks often succumbed to the disease themselves, leaving villagers without guidance. Some saw the plague as divine punishment and responded with extreme acts like self-flagellation, hoping to atone for sins. Others turned to superstition or scapegoated marginalized groups, resulting in violence and persecution. Isolation became common. Families abandoned sick relatives out of fear. Community bonds frayed as survival instinct overtook compassion. Economic and social consequences. In the wake of the Black Death, the economic balance shifted. Labor became scarce, and surviving peasants found they had increased bargaining power. Wages rose in some areas as lords competed for workers, though attempts to control wages with laws often failed. These changes sowed the seeds for the gradual decline of feudalism and the rise of a more market-oriented economy. However, in the immediate aftermath, peasants suffered immensely from the trauma, loss, and instability. For those peasants who managed to avoid the plague in its earliest waves, survival came at a steep price. Infected villages were often sealed off from the outside world, either by local authorities or out of sheer desperation. Entire communities became ghost towns, isolated by fear and death. The peasants who remained alive were often trapped in silence, surrounded by the dead, terrified of human contact. Access to food quickly became one of the greatest challenges. With so many workers dying or fleeing, harvests failed. Livestock wandered unattended, starved, or were stolen. Grain mills fell into disrepair. Many peasants, lacking the means to store food long-term, were left to forage in forests, risk eating spoiled grain, or slaughter the few animals they had left, often far too early to sustain them through winter. Many starved to death not because there was no food in the land, but because the systems that produced and distributed it had collapsed. Bread, the central pillar of the medieval diet, became a rare luxury. Fresh vegetables and meat disappeared. Hunger was constant, and even those who escaped the plague itself were consumed by malnutrition, cold, and physical exhaustion. The social structure of peasant villages had relied heavily on cooperation. Fields were often farmed in strips shared among families, tools were borrowed and lent, and the community provided mutual aid during hard times. But under the specter of plague, those bonds were severed. Neighbors locked their doors against one another. Those suspected of being ill were shunned or forced out. Mothers abandoned their children. Husbands left their wives. Fear corroded every human relationship. Even the sick were sometimes dragged outside of villages and left to die alone in the woods or fields, as others feared contamination. Corpses were burned or buried hastily, if at all. In many places, the dead lay in homes or along roads for days or weeks. The smell of decay was everywhere. Medicine and superstition. A world without hope. Medieval peasants had virtually no access to medical care. Physicians were few and catered mainly to nobles and clergy. Even then, most treatments were based on outdated ideas, such as the balance of the four humors blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Remedies often included bloodletting, leeches, or bizarre herbal mixtures, none of which helped and many of which hastened death. Peasants relied largely on local healers, herbalists, or midwives, many of whom were powerless against the sheer speed and lethality of the plague. Some turned to superstition. Amulets, charms, and prayers written on parchment were worn around the neck. Others burned herbs or bathed in vinegar in the hope of driving out the bad air they believed caused the illness. Religious explanations dominated. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for sin. Peasants would march through the streets in public acts of penance, self-flagellation, or fasting. Some wandered from town to town barefoot and bleeding, trying to appease what they believed was God's wrath. Others prayed obsessively, wept openly, or gave away all they had in hopes of mercy. But the plague did not discriminate. It struck the pious and the wicked alike. This created a deep spiritual crisis. Many peasants began to question the church's authority. When priests fled their posts or refused to bury the dead, trust in religious institutions crumbled. The loss of spiritual support, combined with physical suffering and social collapse, created a bleak and terrifying world where hope was almost impossible to find. Mass death, mass graves, and the loss of humanity. The scale of death was beyond comprehension. In some areas, entire generations were lost. Villages with populations of several hundred were reduced to a handful of survivors. Entire families vanished without a trace. Children became orphans overnight. In a society where family and land were everything, the emotional trauma was unimaginable. Burial practices, once sacred and essential, became impossible. Graveyards overflowed. Coffins were too expensive, and even shrouds were rare. The dead were thrown into pits hastily dug by teams of gravediggers, who were sometimes drunk, infected, or indifferent. These mass graves, often shallow and unmarked, were filled with hundreds or thousands of bodies. For peasants, death had once been accompanied by ritual. A priest's blessing, a vigil, a procession. Now it was anonymous, brutal, and final. Even mourning became dangerous. To be near a corpse was to risk infection. Families grieved in silence, if they survived at all. Children were sometimes left to fend for themselves. Without parents or guardians, they roamed the countryside, begging or stealing food. Some were taken in by distant relatives, but many were simply left to die. Abandonment became common. Even animals suffered. Dogs and cats, often blamed as carriers, were killed en masse in some towns. Livestock died from neglect or starvation. Wolves and other wild animals returned to depopulated areas, drawn by the smell of decay and the collapse of human control over the land. Rising tensions and violent reactions. In the chaos, people turned to violence. Desperate to find meaning in their suffering, many sought scapegoats. Foreigners, Jews, beggars, lepers, and women were all accused of spreading the disease. Accusations of well poisoning were common, and thousands of innocent people were tortured or executed in spontaneous mob justice or through sanctioned purges. Peasants, already at the bottom of society, often bore the brunt of this rage. Yet they also rebelled. As labor shortages gave them rare leverage, some demanded better wages or lower rents. When their lords refused, resistance turned to revolt. In England, for example, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, just a few decades after the worst years of the Black Death, was fueled in part by the resentment born from the plague's aftermath. While the disease had temporarily disrupted the feudal structure, attempts to restore it brutally led to unrest. However, most revolts were crushed. Retaliation was swift and violent. Peasants were executed, villages burned, and old hierarchies restored, at least for a time. The long-term legacy, a changed world built on ruins. Though the Black Death brought unimaginable suffering, it also marked a turning point. Feudalism, already strained before the plague, began to erode. With fewer workers, peasants could sometimes demand higher wages or better conditions. Landlords, desperate to avoid the ruin of their estates, were forced to compromise. In some regions, serfdom declined. Peasants were able to rent land or sell their labor more freely. Urban migration increased. New opportunities emerged, but only for those who survived. However, for the average peasant living through the worst years of 1347 to 1351, these changes offered no comfort. Most would not live to see these benefits. They lived and died in a time of unimaginable terror, poverty, and loss. The psychological impact of the Black Death cannot be overstated. Survivors were scarred for life. The trauma passed through generations, expressed in art, literature, and oral history for centuries to come. A once stable, though deeply unequal world had crumbled, and a new one rose on its bones. Legal oppression in the aftermath. Though the death toll had decimated Europe's population, survivors did not find peace or justice waiting for them. For peasants, particularly in England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the years after the plague brought not relief but repression. Labor was now in critically short supply. Fields needed tilling, harvests needed reaping, but the workforce had been gutted. Nobles and landowners, terrified that peasants might use their newfound leverage to demand fair wages or move to other manors offering better conditions, quickly turned to the law to freeze society in place. In England, for example, the Ordinance of Labourers 1349, and later the Statute of Labourers 1351, made it illegal for workers to demand higher wages than they had earned before the plague. These laws also tried to fix prices and restrict labor mobility. Peasants who attempted to negotiate better pay or fled their assigned land could be imprisoned, branded, or worse. Across Europe, similar policies were enacted. The idea was to restore order, but in practice, these laws punished the poor for surviving. The contradiction was grotesque. After living through the worst pandemic in human history, those who remained were chained even tighter to a system that had failed to protect them. The elite sought to maintain their wealth and power by preserving a pre-plague status quo, despite the fact that society itself had been irreparably altered. Peasants had no vote, no representation, and no legal means to protest. The lords had land, wealth, armed guards, and royal backing. The peasants had only their bodies, and those had been pushed to the breaking point. Psychological and emotional collapse. While historians can document death tolls and economic impacts, one aspect of the peasant experience during the Black Death remains largely invisible: the psychological destruction. Modern understandings of trauma, PTSD, and mental health didn't exist in the 14th century, but the signs were everywhere. Survivors often described feelings of guilt, despair, detachment, and numbness. Chronic stress and fear warped communities. In village after village, those who endured were left isolated, grieving, and unsure of their place in the world. The comforting rhythms of communal life, church bells, feast days, marriages, and harvest festivals vanished for years. In their place was silence, mourning, and often madness. Peasants lived with a crushing sense of unpredictability. The Black Death did not follow understandable patterns. It could spare one household and decimate the next. Healthy children could be dead by nightfall. A single cough from a neighbor could spell doom. In the face of such relentless uncertainty, many gave up entirely. In some regions, survivors adopted a fatalistic, almost nihilistic worldview. If God had allowed this horror, what meaning did anything have? Art and religious expression became dark, obsessed with death, decay, and the apocalypse. Skeletons, graves, and demons filled the imagery of the age. The peasant worldview, already shaped by hardship, became soaked in a profound and permanent fear. This cultural shift can still be seen in the period's folklore, songs, and visual art. The rise of the danse macabre, dance of death, the obsession with Judgment Day, and the sudden popularity of grim moral allegories. For peasants who lived close to the land and closer still to death, this was not symbolism, it was daily reality. Disease was only one threat. It's tempting to think the plague was the sole cause of suffering, but for peasants, it was just the most dramatic part of a much larger nightmare. In many areas, the plague came in waves, not just once. Major outbreaks occurred again in 1361, 1369, 1374, 1400, and beyond. Each time it returned, the cycle of death, hunger, and fear repeated. Entire generations were marked by repeated trauma. Even in plague-free years, peasants faced famine due to labor shortages and disrupted agriculture, increased taxation to fund wars and rebuild cities, inflation making food and tools unaffordable, random violence from roaming bandits, unpaid soldiers, or desperate townsfolk, forced labor conscription for rebuilding efforts or war campaigns. Natural disasters only made things worse. Floods, droughts, and harsh winters still struck with no warning. Without the safety nets of modern economies, a single poor harvest could tip entire regions into chaos. Social distrust also lingered. Peasants, who once depended on neighbors for mutual survival, were now wary of each other. Infected households were often ostracized, survivors seen as cursed or marked. Superstition governed relationships, not solidarity. And for peasants, there was nowhere to run. Urban workers could sometimes leave cities. Nobles could flee to country estates. Priests and merchants could travel or be protected by institutions. The peasants, they were bound to the land, both legally and economically. And the land was often soaked in death. The long-term social impact of the Black Death was transformative, but the immediate experience for the peasant class was one of mass extinction. Some estimates suggest 20 to 25 million people died in Europe between 1347 and 1351, nearly half the population. In some rural areas, mortality rates reached 60 to 80%. This meant entire family lines disappeared in a matter of weeks. Farmsteads were abandoned. Tools rusted in sheds. Fields were swallowed by weeds. Orphans wandered alone, many dying without names or burials. Elders who depended on their children for care were left to starve. Women who survived found themselves alone in societies where protection and income were tied to male relatives. Widows could not remarry if no men were left. Many simply died of neglect or exposure. Even those who inherited land from deceased family members rarely benefited. Without labor to cultivate it or markets to sell produce, the land became a burden. And with increased taxation and oppressive labor laws, any advantage gained was quickly crushed by noble greed. The memory of the Black Death became interwoven with the soil. In some villages, people refused to live in certain houses, claiming they were plague-cursed. Entire regions were repopulated only slowly, with newcomers ignorant of the suffering buried beneath the surface. To be a peasant during the Black Death was not simply to suffer through a disease. It was to be crushed beneath the weight of a world collapsing from every direction. This was not a moment of temporary hardship. It was a sustained and apocalyptic trauma. For years, peasants lived amid mass death, starvation, terror, exploitation, and abandonment. The very institutions they had been taught to trust, the church, the nobility, even the land itself, failed them or turned against them. The social structure that had defined their lives for generations proved powerless against the plague, yet it clung on to control them even after the horror had passed. There was no healing for most. No counseling, no justice, no recognition. Most peasants died as they lived, poor, unnamed, and invisible in the eyes of history. No chroniclers recorded their final words. No books carried their memories. They were buried in pits, forgotten. And yet it was the peasant class, their hands, their backs, their lives, that held Europe together during the worst catastrophe in recorded history. They dug the graves. They buried the dead. They returned to the fields when no one else would. They rebuilt what had fallen apart, often under threat, often alone. Their suffering made the recovery possible, even if they reaped none of the benefits. A landscape of loss. In the aftermath of the initial wave, Europe became a continent of absences. The hum of village life was replaced by silence. Church bells rang not for celebration but for the endless toll of death. Animals roamed untended. Oxen wandered from collapsed barns. Pigs rooted through abandoned gardens. Even nature seemed to pause. Birds no longer sang over towns cloaked in plague. Survivors spoke of an eerie stillness, as if time itself had frozen. The physical decay mirrored a deeper spiritual and psychological rot. Faith, once a source of comfort, had been fractured. People watched as priests refused last rites or fled towns entirely. Monasteries that once housed learning and care became sites of death. Monks died in rows. Nuns buried sisters in silence. When the church did remain, it often demanded more. Indulgences were sold to the desperate. Flagellant cults paraded through towns, whipping themselves in public, preaching divine punishment. These displays offered spectacle but no solace. For the peasants, whose lives had been ruled by religious calendars and clerical authority, the collapse of the church's moral leadership left them disoriented. Their world was no longer governed by divine order but by chaos. And in chaos, the powerful adapted quickly. The poor did not. The economy of death. Feudalism depended on the constancy of labor. The manor system, lords providing land and protection in exchange for service, relied on population stability. The Black Death shattered this equilibrium. In many villages, so few people remained that there were not enough hands to plant or harvest. Grain rotted in silos. Entire seasons of agricultural production were lost. Markets became irrelevant when there was nothing to trade and no one to trade with. Craftsmen vanished. Apprentices died with their masters. Skills honed over decades disappeared overnight. But scarcity created value. For the first time in generations, peasants who survived found themselves in demand. Landowners needed tenants. They needed ploughmen, shepherds, milkmaids. In theory, this could have improved lives, but the ruling classes resisted change. Rather than adapt, they imposed controls. The Statute of Laborers in England, 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, making it illegal for workers to seek better pay elsewhere. Lords demanded the return of runaway serfs. Local officials hunted those who dared to move in search of opportunity. Violence became a tool to enforce the old order. In France, similar measures were enacted. In parts of Germany, peasants were tied to their lords through renewed obligations. Despite the labor crisis, the ruling elite acted not with reform but repression. The idea that peasants had earned anything through their suffering was inconceivable to those in power. The seeds of resistance. Still, the plague had planted dangerous ideas of movement, of choice, of worth. Some peasants defied laws and traveled to new towns where labor was needed. Others negotiated better terms for tenancy. A few, emboldened by loss, refused to return to servitude at all. This quiet rebellion spread over years, culminating in open defiance. In 1381, England erupted. The peasants' revolt, sparked by oppressive taxation and class cruelty, surged across the countryside. Villages marched on London. Manor houses were looted. The king was confronted. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, its echo lingered. In Italy, guilds of workers began asserting more power, especially in cities like Florence, which had lost vast portions of their population. In parts of Germany, religious movements formed around the idea of equality under God, not hierarchy. These were not revolutions as we think of them today, but they were ruptures. The idea that peasants were mere bodies to till land and die quietly had been shaken. The Black Death had revealed something fatal to the elite. Their system was not eternal, could break. It had broken. A generation raised in ruin. Children born in the 1350s and 1360s inherited a broken world. Many never knew extended families. Uncles, aunts, cousins gone. Some were raised by survivors too traumatized to speak of what had been lost. Others grew up wild, unchurched, unschooled, unclaimed. This generation would become the labor force of the late 14th century. They had no memory of the world before, only of its aftermath. Some benefited from the reduced population. Opportunities opened in towns. Wages, though suppressed by law, rose in practice. A young laborer might now own land or lease a shop. A shepherd could earn enough to live independently. Women, though still confined by patriarchal norms, found new space as widows, midwives, healers, and traders. But trauma lingered beneath the surface. Folklore absorbed the loss. Tales of restless spirits, dancing skeletons, and death as a constant companion emerged in art and song. The danse macabre, popular across Europe, showed rich and poor alike dancing hand in hand with death. It was not simply a memento mori. It was a portrait of shared helplessness. For peasants, this art spoke a truth they had always known. Death did not discriminate, but society did. Cultural amnesia and historical silence. The chroniclers of the time wrote of kings and plagues, battles and saints. Rarely did they name the peasant dead. Their accounts focused on the spectacular, the spread of the disease, the behavior of cities, the fall of great men. What they ignored were the daily tragedies. The mother who buried 5 children before succumbing herself. The teenager who dug graves until his hands bled. The old man who died alone, his body found weeks later in a ruined hut. No monuments were erected for these people. No ballads were sung. They passed from memory not because they were unimportant, but because they were too many, too poor, too ordinary to matter to those who recorded history. And yet, they were the majority. The Black Death was not a noble tragedy. It was a peasant apocalypse. From ashes, foundations. As the century wore on, Europe began to stabilize. Not return to normal, normal was gone. But to something new. Feudal obligations continued to erode. Cities gained more autonomy. Trade slowly resumed. The Renaissance, still decades away, began to germinate. None of this would have been possible without the labor of the peasant class. They cleared the fields, rebuilt homes, raised livestock, maintained roads. They repopulated villages, restarted economies, and ensured that future generations had a world to inherit. Their work was unrecognized, but essential. They were the quiet architects of recovery, a legacy in silence. Today, the memory of the Black Death still haunts Europe in literature and folklore, but the peasant experience remains largely invisible. Historians have only recently begun to piece together their stories, not through royal chronicles, but through wills, manorial records, skeletal remains, and scattered letters. We now know more than ever before, but still we do not know enough. What were their final thoughts? Their dreams? Did they feel hope? Bitterness? Did they believe the world could be better? Or simply that survival was enough? We cannot answer, but we can acknowledge the truth that history tried to forget. Europe was rebuilt by the broken, by those who had lost everything yet continued, by the unnamed dead in unmarked graves, by the women who raised children alone, by the men who turned back to ruined fields and sowed them anyway, by the elders who shared stories no one wrote down. This was their legacy: survival in the face of abandonment, hope in a world that offered none, labor in a system that rewarded them with silence. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson of the Black Death. Not the statistics or the politics, but the endurance of the ordinary. The world as we know it exists because the peasants refused to let it die. They held the line when no one else would. They deserve to be remembered,